afternoon, you with Newsfeed. Glad you're able to join us this afternoon. Well, I hope you've already checked that you're registered to vote. The IEC's registration weekend starts tomorrow. You can check online, you can check by SMS. You can also look to see where you're registered to vote. But here's a bigger question. Have you decided on who you're going to vote for? What makes all of this so much more complicated is it seems likely that many councils and metros will be governed by coalitions, and that can make life a lot more complicated. Look at the recent history of them. So then, how can we make sure coalitions govern effectively? Are they always going to be difficult to manage? Ebrahim Fakir is the Director of Programs at the Auwal Socioeconomic Research Institute. Amuzweni Ngoma is a researcher at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. Good afternoon to you both. Amuzweni, if I may start with you, I would think if you look at the councils that are governed by coalitions in South Africa, you don't really see an improvement in governance. Is it always the case that if you have a coalition, you must have bad governance?
Thanks, Stephen. I think that's a really important question. And I think to date, if we really think about it, the crude short answer might be, a tendency towards a strong yes, that we have seen bad governance, coalitions and their parties governing badly. But I think to flip that question a little bit, we should be asking that given the experience of political parties in coalitions, are there any mechanisms, right, or strategies and tools that can actually improve the way that political parties actually work inside a government together? Can we improve the way that political parties communicate with each other, the way that they use different mechanisms like the media to complain about their conflict and misunderstandings, or whether or not they actually institute working, cooperating committees that allow them to smooth out their conflicts behind closed doors and ensure that the conflict that might arise in the future is actually sorted out through, very good mechanisms of committee. Another thing that is very important in terms of ensuring that perhaps political parties, when they run a government in coalition, actually achieve the mandate that they write down in the mandate that they actually agree on as a coalition would be to actually, in the beginning, decide what kind of collaboration those parties might want to do, decide on the kinds of policies that they might want to follow, and also decide on the kinds of programs that they would collectively follow, and then put that in a coalition agreement. And use the coalition agreement as a basis for ironing out any misunderstandings and also any conflicts and disagreements that might come up in the course of the coalition. So, in short, I think it's very important, perhaps, to look at the mechanisms that can ensure that coalitions actually work better in government, as opposed to just thinking through the kind of conflict that might just necessarily collapse or disintegrate the coalitions that are formed. And this is really important because if we think about how difficult it is, in fact, to get people to come to a compromise, to get people to come to a consensus, to get people to forget themselves when they're trying to collaborate and run an effective government, we might actually think that it would be necessary to have those kinds of tools and instruments that improve the workability of coalitions in government.
So, Amuzweni, in practice, would that mean then, for example, and I mean, I would love to see this, but I don't know if this would happen, would it mean that parties who are going to get into a coalition sign an agreement in public that voters can see about how they're going to resolve differences, what they're going to achieve? I mean, that would surely have an impact on the success or failure of the coalition.
Typically, we see in the European examples that, coalition agreements aren't always things that are signed in public, right? And coalitions agreements are not always things that, the public knows the letter of. They're typically something that is just obscure and negotiated in the background. But I do think that if we were actually able to move political parties to a space where they are open and honest about the terms on which they have agreed to enter into a coalition, that for themselves would actually ensure that they are true in one way or another to the manifesto and the promises that they would have made to the electorate, so that the electorate themselves do not necessarily end up punishing them for entering into a coalition that did not deliver what they had promised at the point of their manifestos and in the electioneering. So if we have a kind of a strip the veil on what agreements have actually been built between political parties, we might actually have greater adherence, right, to coalition agreements and the formation, whatever it is that they agree that they would take forward in their coalitions.
Ebrahim, I mean, is there a difficulty in South Africa that because our country has such huge inequality, the political parties have such different ideologies? I'm going to come to the possible death of ideology in a moment, but in public they have such different ideologies. Ebrahim, does that make it harder for them to get a coalition together than it would in other countries that are much more homogeneous?
Even it does and it doesn't. And the reason I'm being that vague and deliberately sort of ambiguous is because we need to face another question. And that is, do we actually have experience of coalitions? And I'm not sure we do, except in very few and selected cases, such as the DA is in fact a coalition. The ANC in part is an alliance. Sure, we can talk about the niceties and the differences of that. But in fact, what you're referring to when you're talking about the 2016 experience with local government, particularly in the metros, is you're in fact talking about minority governments, not necessarily coalitions. And minority governments are vastly different, fundamentally different from coalitions. Now, there may be overlaps, there may be points of convergence between them, but essentially, minority governments are basically a government of a party which won the largest amount of votes, perhaps, or sometimes not even the largest amount of votes, but is a party which comes together because the party which either got the highest number of votes didn't have enough to form a government on its own in that local council, or alternatively, they had the highest number, but they themselves couldn't, so they need to take someone on, right? So those are essentially minority governments. And minority governments depend on the nature of agreements they struck, the stuff that Amuzweni was referring to, the kind of agreements they strike with those people with who they rely on to put them in power. Now, those people who put that minority government in power can decide either to go along with most things they decide and then in dark and back rooms or smoke-filled rooms reach other agreements, or they say to that party, we put you in power, but we will vote with you strategically, or we will vote with you issue to issue. And that's the kind of instability we saw emerging in Pretoria, Tshwane, in Nelson Mandela Bay. And then what happens is the incentive to play brinkmanship in each of the constituent parties that make up this minority government, or the one who aids the other one, or you have bits inside the major parties, such as, for example, the DA, the major differences of opinion, often which spill out. So, this question of, are coalitions the future? Will coalitions work? How do we make them work? Are they based necessarily on ideology? Should they be done before an election? Should they be done after an election? Those are all different questions from the question of, do we have experience with coalitions? Short answer, not very much. Do we have experience with minority governments? Yes, overwhelmingly negative because of the brinkmanship. The second broad point is that, you've got to understand the political culture within which we function, right? And the parties are in there for very small, incremental types of advantage. And, in this incremental advantage, you've got to think, okay, there's some gains which they've made for the public, for citizens, for voters. But largely, those incremental gains, at what cost have they come? So you think about certain things like, for example, the EFF insisting that there must be insourcing of workers. A fantastic idea because it's great for social protection, it's great for workers, it's great even for service delivery provided there's a sufficient supervision and oversight inside councils. But at what cost did that come? Tender procurement fixing, contract rigging, preferential pork barrel type politics. So what's the cost at which the small incremental advantages come? So you've got to think about these coalitions or even minority governments in very many ways, but we must get better also at talking about things specifically.
There's so many different angles to this. And I suppose the next question, Amuzweni, becomes, do we have too many players? By which I mean too many small political parties. And again, and I take Ebrahim's point very seriously about, minority governments rather than coalition governments. But if you look at what, for example, the Patriotic Alliance did with just 2 seats, they had just 2 seats in Nelson Mandela Bay. And they were able to use those 2 seats very, very effectively. Is that one of the problems, that we have so many players in these coalitions, or in these sort of, administrations, whatever we call them?
I take the point about trying to distinguish between a coalition and minority government, and also speaking to whether or not South Africa has experience in coalitions. South Africa actually has a lot of experience with coalitions. And I think the point that Ebrahim is probably making about a minority government probably more or less relates to the Ekurhuleni kind of case, more than it relates to Tshwane, more than it relates to Johannesburg, and more than it relates to the Nelson Mandela Bay. And this stuff is clearly shown in the 17 or 18 plus chapters of the book that Mr. wrote on coalition politics in South Africa. When we speak about the Patriotic Alliance, I mean, the Patriotic Alliance is a very small party, right, that did use its kind of like 2 seats to its own best advantage, right? But as a small party, and also having other bigger parties themselves that are not able, right, to negotiate a coalition, to find a meeting point, even if they are ideologically disparate, will then obviously fall prey to the antics and shenanigans of parties like Patriotic Alliance. If bigger parties are not themselves able to come to the party and put their differences aside and negotiate a workable kind of like coalition. Always, Stephen, it's always going to happen that any small political party, and this has also been seen in very small kind of like towns in the Eastern Cape, where Ndisi Lekiana actually wrote about the very small political parties that were in play at local government and in very small local government municipalities, where they got a lot of seats and even brought the DA to its knees in terms of trying to negotiate about how it is that they would get the mayor and which seat they would get. And that only in fact happens if the big players at the table are not able to find a meeting point. Obviously, but the Patriotic Alliance is going to use that to its advantage. The same thing happened with the AIC in the Ekurhuleni, right, where it was, Bonolo Makale, also another author in the book, calls it the Queenmaker. Able to partner with the ANC so that they can get that kind of like majority that they actually need to run that council. So I don't think we necessarily have to speak about minority governments as a distinctive factor, and rather speak about the fact that, I mean, there's more than 22 counts of coalitions that have actually happened in South Africa. Even from a national level, we think about as far back as 1994, the Government of National Unity, right? And a number of also coalitions that have also happened in the KwaZulu-Natal province. So coalitions have been around. I think the question that we must really just kind of like drive through is, are they working? And, are they working? And if they're not working, how is it that we can actually improve the quality of the coalition experience? Because if we don't, we understand, even when we look at the Nelson Mandela Bay and the service delivery kind of like failures that have happened there as a result of councils that are not able to make decisions because the PA or the late ANC representative are busy playing particular antics within council, right? And people throwing jugs and that kind of thing. So I think it's very important to really speak about how we improve the quality of coalition experience, because coalitions are here to stay. They've been here and they're also here to stay. So political parties that want to survive in the next 10 years are going to have to seriously take good coalition practice as a long-term political strategy. Otherwise, the electorate, we imagine that the electorate is not looking at the kinds of antics that different party leaders are doing. They actually are watching, and they're also suffering. They are the victims of bad service delivery when decisions aren't adequately made by coalition governments. And also, we also have like the kinds of opportunity costs that come with bad governance when the economy doesn't grow, people lose jobs and that kind of thing, because people, political parties are not able to make the right decisions within their coalitions. So it is important that we start speaking about coalition governments that work, right? We start speaking about improving the quality of the coalition experience, and we also start very clearly saying that coalitions that don't work are very expensive. They're expensive to service delivery, and they also hit the ratepayers very hard in their pockets. Thanks, Stephen. Let me pause there.
There's so much to say about it all, isn't there? Ebrahim, I promised that we would talk about the death of ideology, and let me make, I'm not going to say this is a prediction, but let me say this could happen, that it is possible after the elections, because there's so many different councils and so many different possible outcomes, that you could have some parties in coalition with each other. I'm going to put names to it just to help out the example, right? I'm not saying this will definitely happen. But it's entirely possible that you could have the ANC and the EFF in a coalition, say, in Tshwane, and the DA and the EFF in a coalition in Johannesburg, just down the N1 from each other. What does that say about ideology and whether ideology matters?
Yeah, I think ideology does matter, and it should matter. And I think there was a brief period after globalization where there was a drive globally towards this kind of neoliberal centering of arrangements around what governments would look like, even democratic governments. Okay, and eventually a lot of political parties started tending towards particular ideas, even though there were certain nuances and differences in approach. They broadly tended towards similar approaches, and you would find that a similar thing is happening here in South Africa. It happened now, of course, with new parties coming into the fray. There are differences between them. No one argues that there aren't. No one is saying that ideology doesn't matter at all. The point here is that the ideology appears to matter less, and what matters even less to most of the parties is a set of fidelity to principles. So no one's committed either to their own set of ideas which they proffer, and they use their principles and they use those ideas and make them so malleable and so flexible that they fit particular situations. So you could have at one point the DA justifying why it got into a coalition, or into an arrangement, not a coalition, into an arrangement with the EFF, and why the EFF, for its part, claims it was involved in an arrangement with the DA, wouldn't stand to any of its real principles. In fact, at the time, they said, we will never coalesce with the party or work with them if they don't support amendments to Section 25. Lo and behold, once the lure of position, once the lure of entry into council, and once the lure of influencing tenders, contracts, procurement, spending, and so on was on the table, suddenly principles start to become flexible. Now you simply need to look across the continent, Lesotho, Kenya, for example, one election to another election. Today's enemies are tomorrow's friends. Tomorrow's friends are the next election's enemies, where literally you had coalitions, partners from one election were fighting in pre-election coalitions, not even after. These are not even arrangements after an election. This is before an election. They are killing the very people they were involved with in the election which just passed 5 years ago. Now, in that instance, you have a public will which will legitimately ask, what do you actually stand for? And in whose interests do you govern other than your own very narrowly defined set of ones? And sometimes this is so bad because, listen, all politics is partly patronage-based, right? It's the reason you get into power is to distribute resources, power, and influence in particular ways, particular classes in society. And unfortunately, our politics don't appear to be forming on a set of ideas and a set of class interests where people are pursuing a particular set of interests, and you simply use crude identity markers. And because these identity markers are both crude but also fairly flexible, you can use them very quickly to spur on emotions or cobble together a set of political objectives. And then you pursue that because that becomes your overriding principle. But below that, the real practice of what you do as a government, whether in coalition or whether in partnership where you're just working together for a brief period, the consequences on a broader public and a public agenda is in fact debilitating. So when you talk about the death of ideology, you need to talk about the death, more importantly, of principle and fidelity to principle. So basic things like basic values, basic honesty, basic reasons for why you wish to get into power and who you want to work with and for what purpose you want to work with them.
I mean, Amuzweni, if what Ebrahim says is correct, and I think it must be actually, what that means is that people get more and more cynical about politics and fewer people vote. And so the outcomes can actually get less and less legitimate.
Absolutely. But the other thing is that we must understand about, the prevailing political culture in any countries, that it is ever changing. Right. So if we look at our neighbors and we look at, what other people are doing on other continents, we might actually just extract particular lessons that inform us about how, what kinds of smart coalition politics are possible for South Africa. Right. On the one end, we understand that some parties are very afraid of being juniorized when they are in a coalition. Right. Of actually just being having their party political identity subsumed by a very well working kind of like coalition, and then that party then loses its kind of like identity and credibility and gets punished at the next election cycle. So what you will have inside a working coalition is that there are moments during that duration of the coalition where parties want to kind of like distinguish themselves, where parties want to remind the electorate and the nation about who they are and the principles to which they still stand. And you might find that the principles to which they stand, or the ideology of a particular party, stands against that of the coalition within which they are practicing. And this is kind of like the nitty-gritty balancing act and the art and the skillful play that political parties and their leaders actually just get into, about trying to either maintain and work alongside whatever coalition or loose arrangement that they have with maybe, like, for example, the EFF and the DA, where they have a issue-to-issue, vote-to-vote kind of like agreement, and then the next thing, boom, EFF stands up and says that this is not working. We want, expropriation without compensation, and therefore kind of like distracting and also weakening that kind of like alliance that they might have had with the DA. That really is about a party trying to maintain its identity. A party also concerned with growing its kind of like base and support base. So necessarily there are moments that are going to be very antagonistic, and there are necessarily moments that are actually going to be particularly collaborative. And we must, as an electorate and a nation, kind of like be discerning enough to understand when that is happening and when for what purpose it's kind of like happening, and not to necessarily ascribe that to a total, complete indication of the fact that coalitions may not or cannot work at all. Mauritius is a very good kind of like example. And Mauritius is a good example, particularly in relation to the fact that the country is very heterogeneous in terms of like ethnicity. And so political parties and their leaders in Mauritius actually understand that without a coalition, they won't see government. They actually can't win. They make pre-electoral kind of like alliances so that they can actually form a working government. But the long game of the leaders of parties in Mauritius is that they're able to understand that over time, with good practice in government, they actually might supersede what once was a dominant, not dominant in terms of like a majority, but number one or number two, and kind of like supersede and have a rearrangement of who's third and who's second and who's third and who's fourth and fifth in terms of like the support base. Now, those parties that understand coalition workability as a long-term political strategy are the ones that will win, right? Those parties that actually come up with the skills and understand the art of negotiating and managing and working well are the ones that will survive, because the electorate is ever shifting. People change people, it might look like 10 years is a long time, but it will happen, right? And so the electorate is constantly shifting, constantly looking and watching at what people are doing and actually making very specific decisions about what it is that they will vote for and what they might not vote for. I think right now what we have is probably an overstretched middle class in South Africa. An overstretched middle class in South Africa because of the 2.2 million plus jobs that have been lost, which basically means that a lot of people that are currently in employment are also then financially carrying, the people that have lost employment. Right? And if you have governments that are not working well, if you have governments that are not making sure that the service delivery, that are taxing and also then extracting too much from the salaries of the people that are working, you must know that you will be punished at the polling stations. And these are the things that must be managed.
We've got a minute left. Ebrahim, we've spoken a little bit about the long term. The short term, it would seem to me the ANC losing support, the DA losing support, the EFF perhaps, and it's perhaps gaining support. That puts them in the position of kingmaker. How do you expect that to affect governance over the next 5 years? It might be, do you think governance is going to improve or get worse in coalitions after this election?
Impossible to tell, Stephen, for one simple reason that, you see, when you talk whether in relation to the question you've just asked or the previous question around ideology, it matters more for a national posture. In this instance, what you have to do is you have to look at each municipality or each metro, because that is really where the cookie is going to crumble. Remember, local government is all about service delivery, all about the coalface of government, of what you can do for the people who live in your area, less about the grand ideological take. Now, of course, the grand ideological take matters because it determines how you're going to approach local government, but also what trade-offs you'll make with other parties at different levels. So if I give you this at local level, what will you give me elsewhere? So it starts to complicate things a whole lot more. But if you talk about the governance posture generally, we have to get serious about two things. A, our political parties have to stop taking the public for a mess, because that's what they do. They treat the public with complete disdain. They think they get into government for their own incremental business instead of serving the public, number one. Number two, parties get serious about what they believe in, what they stand for, what they're prepared to sacrifice, and what they're prepared to concede if they're going to work together with other parties. Number three, they got to get serious about their agenda and what their agenda is, rather than to use their agenda as a smokescreen to in fact engage in an cumulative and acquisitive approach to the way in which public resources mean to them. And fourth, political parties have to get serious about how they want to work with other political parties rather than against them. Because remember, you're not working against another party, you're working against a portion of the public.
Ebrahim Fakir, Director of Programs at the Auwal Socioeconomic at the Auwal Socioeconomic Research Institute. Amuzweni Ngoma, researcher at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. Both of you, thank you very much indeed.